Hello everybody, welcome. We should be joined shortly by Samantha Woodham, who's going to be our guest presenter today. I'm just going to wait for Sam to join and hopefully join as a presenter. I can see she's in the room, so I'm just going to invite her on stage now. Here she comes. Hello, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm so sorry. I think I must have clicked on the wrong link because I was there merrily just in the audience. But thank you.
No problem at all. It's quite a new tech and setup. I'm trying out a different webinar platform, so I think it's all a bit strange in this kind of invite to stage business, but you're here now, so that's the main thing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you here because not only do you have a wealth of experience, obviously, as a barrister who actually goes to court and understands the ins and outs of this process, but I know that you're a massive advocate for doing things better and trying to really improve the divorce process for everybody involved. And I know you've done lots of writing and speaking on this subject and had a lot of recognition, not only within kind of the legal sector, but much wider, for the fact that you're so passionate about this. So thank you for coming on and chatting to us today. I think it's going to be really helpful for people. So I think it'd be really, really good to start with the fact that I think everybody kind of makes this assumption that you have to go to court and kind of fight it out. And there's still that kind of assumption and stigma that's attached to, divorce is a battle. And I know that we've discussed that many times in the past. It'd be really great to just explain to people whether, actually you have to go to court and what that actually involves, because I think that a lot of us don't know.
Yeah, I happily. And thanks for having me, by the way. I think it's really important. There's a few things to sort of unpack. But the first is this assumption, like you said, that divorce has to be awful and that it's so stigmatized and that it's going to be a battle is a real problem for all of us as a society generally, because 42% of marriages end in divorce. Most people who divorce go on and remarry. The reality is it's a normal life change that many of us go through in the way that we move house and we change jobs. And we need to find a way to navigate that sensibly and in a dignified way without falling out. Now, that's not represented in the kind of media, and it's not yet represented in the way that we see divorce playing out in films and in TV shows. It's always high drama. But actually, when you look at what the judges want and what the courts want, the family courts in particular recognize that they are the worst place for couples to end up. So there've been a number of reports recently by kind of groups of very senior judges and barristers and solicitors looking at what we need to do. And it's been saying, we need people to understand that court is absolutely the last resort, not the first port of call. That what we want couples to be doing is to looking at solutions-based approaches, not an adversarial approach, which is the court process. But most people have no idea that that's what judges are saying, and that judges are desperate for you to stay away from court. And also, just practically, in answer to your question, you don't need to ever set foot in a court building to get divorced. So there are three things that you need to think about when you're getting divorced from a legal perspective. There's loads of other things to think about emotionally and financially, and we might come to those. But from a legal perspective, there is your divorce petition, which is, changing your legal status, essentially, from married to divorced. And that is something that, can be done over the internet. I mean, it's an online process. It's changing. So from April next year, we should have no fault divorce, which means that you can petition together without ascribing blame, which is great. But it's something that is just done online. You'll then get your decree nisi, and then you get your decree absolute. So you never have to go to court for the divorce. And when the press talk about quickie divorces, there's no such thing as quickie divorce. But generally what they're talking about is that the couple has applied for their decree nisi. So they're going through the divorce petition stage. So that's your first thing to think about, which is a procedural requirement. The second is the division of your finances. So for that, if you want a sort of binding final deal, once you've agreed what's fair, then you need that to be converted into a court order. But that doesn't mean you need to go to court. So you need a consent order drawn up and you need to have that approved by a judge, but that's a paper process. So that can be sent in for the judge to approve on paper. There's no need for either of you to go to court. And the third thing to think about, if you have children, is your children, is what's right for them. How should they share their time between us? How should we manage this transition to a family living apart, but still very much a family? Now, again, judges have extremely strong views. And in fact, it's set out in law that the best people to make those decisions about their children are the parents. So there's something called the no order principle, which means that a court won't make an order regarding children unless it has to, unless it's better than making no order at all. So you don't have any requirement to get any court orders surrounding your child arrangements unless you think that you need them, or yours is a particularly complex situation and you have to go to court for safeguarding reasons. A lot of parents will draw up something called a parenting plan, and sometimes you can get a lawyer to help you with that, or a divorce coach to help you with that. But that's reflecting your agreement about how you want to parent your children going forwards and how you want them to share their time between you. That doesn't need to be approved.
Is that then binding?
No. But I think binding is quite a difficult question when it comes to children. Because everything always has to be kept under review. So even if you were to go through 2 years of stressful litigation and end up with a court order at the end of it, stipulating that the child, would spend such time with one of you and such time with the other, either of you can then go back to court at any stage and say this actually isn't meeting the needs of the child anymore, needs to be changed, because that's the paramount consideration, is the welfare of the child. So it really isn't sort of that, there's so many reasons why court processes aren't really the right ones for families. And that's a classic example. There's never going to be finality when it comes to children, because their needs change as they grow older, situations change. And that's why the best thing is for the parents to be able to talk together constructively when situations change about how the arrangements change.
And so on that note, because obviously you will have seen both going to court and not going to court, how does someone avoid that kind of court process? Kind of what's your advice in the sense of how you actually avoid that entirely and get the right support to, not go to court?
Yeah, I mean, it takes two of you to avoid court in the way that it takes two of you to litigate, takes two of you to settle. So, there are those situations where either because of safety concerns or because of just complete intransigence on the other side, there's really no option but to go to court in order to secure fairness, but luckily, those are very much the minority of couples. For most people, they end up going to court because of a lack of communication and mistrust. And they sort of almost go to court by default because nothing else has worked, or they haven't really known any other option. And so they start off by each going to separate solicitors, getting separate advice, and sort of not talking to each other anymore alongside that process, and not taking charge of the divorce and kind of becoming passengers in it. And they almost sleepwalk into litigation. And so I'd say the best way to avoid court, the first thing to do is just always keep those lines of communication open. And don't allow mistrust to build. Don't allow misconceptions to build. Don't try and second guess what the other person is thinking. Ask them, And so it's thinking about forums in which you can talk about stuff which is really hard at a time when you're both emotional and you're not connecting anymore because you've decided you want to separate. So it's about thinking, okay, how can we facilitate discussions between us that are going to be constructive? And so that's when you think about, okay, what can we share some advice here? Can we share a divorce coach? Can we share a lawyer? Can we go to a financial advisor together? Can we do things in a transparent way so that what isn't happening is that we're just missing each other's cues and we're thinking that one person wants to litigate, when inevitably what happens when you speak to a client who's going to court, they don't want to be there. They don't want to go to court. They're desperate to settle. And you can guarantee that the other person, their spouse, is saying exactly the same thing to their lawyers, but they're missing each other on how they can resolve it. And so communicating together directly, if you can, provided it's safe, is the best first step. Because if you put up barriers so that you're only ever communicating through lawyers, you can really start to miss what the other one is saying. And you, to be honest, when it comes to a negotiation, nobody is going to know what your former partner wants and what motivates them, what drives them better than you. So from a tactical perspective, it's really important to be communicating that and driving that if you have a legal team with them or with your divorce coach, however it's working, so that you can have a kind of really open discussion about, well, look, I know that she will prioritize this or he will prioritize that. So let's think about any settlement within that context.
I suppose the other thing is there are no guarantees or certainties that you're going to be happy with the court decision either, because that decision is then taken out of your hands, isn't it? Whereas at the time before you get to that point, you've still got a say in the process, as you say, to settle and to try and negotiate, and therefore have, find a common ground that suits you both, as opposed to leaving it to the decision of a judge who doesn't know either of you.
And I think the only thing that you can probably guarantee is that neither of you will be happy with the judge-imposed outcome, because you'll have spent an absolute fortune to get there. So the amount to go around will have been reduced. So inevitably that will have an impact on your quality of life on the other side. But also judges are really careful to not make somebody feel like they've won and somebody feel like they've lost, because they know the human interactions and how that will play out later. So inevitably, when you end up going to trial with couples, nobody ends up happy with it. They're relieved it's over, generally, but nobody comes out with any kind of feeling of vindication. And I think that's another thing that is really important to know from the get-go, really, is that the court process is not one that will look at who was to blame for the breakdown of a marriage, or will look back at decisions that were made during a marriage. Judges are extremely forward-looking in what they need to look at. They need to see how your needs are each going to be met going forward in separate households. So often there can be a mismatch between what clients think they're going to get from a court process and actually what they end up receiving. And it's so important at the earliest stage to be really open and honest about, what are my motivations here? When I'm thinking I want to go to court, why do I think that? What do I think I'm going to get out of it? And having a really open conversation with any lawyer who's advising you, so that they can tell you whether that's a realistic ambition or not, because otherwise you're wasting a lot of time and energy and money pursuing something that,
and actually
that
from an emotional
get.
closure perspective, court's not the answer, I don't think.
No, it's the most stressful environment to put two people who are in an emotionally vulnerable place and have them at the mercy of a cross-examination process. It couldn't be worse. It would be my absolute last resort, I can tell you that much. And I think we talk about the financial cost of going to court. What we don't talk enough about is the emotional cost of going to court and the stress that will put on you, and then that will impact your ability to settle, because it impacts your ability not only to communicate with each other, but also just to get perspective over everything, because the minutiae, that the drafting of the witness statements, the admin of court proceedings takes so much time. It's really hard to see the bigger picture. It's really hard to look after yourself and to look after the people around
definitely.
you. And
you've touched on it a little bit, but the costs involved in going to court, I think there's a kind of this misconception as well of my money versus their money, and I think actually it's probably worth highlighting that it's all one pot at this stage, and those court costs come out of that pot, which is then what you're left with to settle with. I'm right in saying that, aren't I?
Yeah, you're right. So essentially, it's really important, and it's one of the things I feel kind of quite strongly about, is that you plan your divorce in the way that you would plan, I don't know, moving house. You know, if you're moving house, you think, okay, well, how much are we going to spend on the estate agents? How much are we going to spend on our conveyancing solicitor? What's the stamp duty? What's our overall cost? And you produce a budget. And nobody does that for divorce, and they really must. Because otherwise you end up with a scenario, and I see it a lot in private practice, where you start a case and you think, okay, well, I think this is the answer. And, you know, the husband can move to this property, the wife can move to this property, and there's enough money to go around. But 2 years later, because of the cost just of the legal proceedings, neither of them can then afford those housing options. And in the majority of cases, yeah, there'll be, you know, a couple will have a set amount of financial resources. If they're each spending tens or, you know, sometimes £100,000 on legal fees, that comes off the top, because those legal fees will have to be paid. Often they're charged against a family home, so they get paid even before the couple get the money. And a judge will look at it when they're figuring out what a fair division is, and will say, well, look, we've got to ensure that both of their legal fees are paid. So that comes off the top before they can look at the rest of their needs. So it's vital, actually, that from the beginning you kind of think, okay, well, how much is this going to cost us in totality? And the problem with the way that legal advice has been provided in this country is that generally it's an hourly rate model. So you'll go and see a solicitor at the beginning of the case, and they'll say, well, look, this is my hourly rate. I would hope if the other side negotiates sensibly, we'll be able to agree without going to court, and it should cost something like this, you know. But they can't control how the other side negotiate, and the other side is being told the same thing. And so costs just snowball, and it's really hard to get them under control, because the only way to stop the costs is to settle. But if you're not communicating well, and it's getting very adversarial, you can't settle. So it's a sort of nightmare, actually, for the couples that are stuck in it, because they can't see a way out, and they don't want to not have legal advice, because these are hugely important decisions about their finances, and they don't want to be representing themselves in court. So it's one of the reasons why, when I set up the divorce surgery, which is enables couples to share one lawyer, one of the things that we thought about was, okay, we know everything about the existing system, you know, so we know what needs to change. And one of the things I felt really strongly about was we need a fixed fee service, so that from day one, couples know how much the entire service is going to cost, and so they can budget. And so they can think, okay, you know, this is how much we're going to spend between us on legal advice. That feels okay. We're also going to need a budget for some pensions advice, maybe a financial advisor as well. Okay, well, let's get a budget for that. That feels right. Maybe we need a little bit of co-parenting help or counselling alongside this. Yes, let's budget for that. Maybe let's have a divorce coach alongside us, helping us do some of the practical forms and just emotionally supporting us through this. And then suddenly they've got a budget for the whole thing, and they've got a team of professionals with the right skills equipped to help them through the whole process, rather than just focusing on the legal skills, which you need. You know, I would say that, I'm a lawyer, but I do think you need some legal advice. It is a legal process, but you don't want that to dominate, and you certainly don't want the cost of that to get to such a degree that there's nothing left. I mean, there was a case recently where a couple were fighting over £600,000, and they spent £595,000 on lawyers. They were left with £5,000. Now, you know, that's absolutely insane. but it happens. So, you know, and the reason it happens is because it's about trying to, like I said, negotiate your way out of it. And you can't. If you can't settle, you somehow can't stop the costs building. So it's about, from the beginning, thinking, what should our budget be? How much are we prepared to spend? And then being really frank, either going for a fixed fee service or being really frank with your lawyer from the get-go and saying, this is how much we're going to spend. So we need to fit the advice within that.
And just on the subject of the divorce surgery, because it is a very unique service in the fact that you are able to represent or work with one couple as a couple, as opposed to, you know, that communication breakdown between, you know, two different solicitors. And, you know, I see it a lot with working with couples where they have different legal teams and you know, they're only ever getting one side, and it's actually really helpful to sit in the middle and get the people around the table and be able to broker that relationship, which, as you say, has to you know, strengthen and last beyond the divorce when there's children involved as well, which I said, I don't know of any other solicitor firms that are doing that. So can you just talk a little bit more about that and what that then means for the couple, and because I know also that means avoiding court as well. So if you can just tell us a bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, so I've been a barrister for 15 years now, and my practice is exclusively kind of the repercussions of divorce. So it's either I'd be working with clients who needed to agree division of finances or their child arrangements. And increasingly, I was dealing with the more complex cases, be that because of the, you know, high net worth individuals or extremely complex issues relating to children. And so my practice was an awful lot of litigation as a barrister. A lot of what I did was coming in very early and trying to, you know, I always see success for me is if my clients never go near court buildings. So always thinking strategically, how can we settle this early? What do we need to do so that you never end up going to court? Because ceding that control to a judge who imposes a decision on you is always the worst case scenario. So you should avoid it if you can. So that was really my practice. But I was frustrated with the process that I was in, and that I was always ever only able to hear one side. And so you end up with this really bizarre situation where you know your client so well, you know their perspective so intimately. And yet the former spouse, who's the other half of this divorce settlement, I would never even hear them speak. I mean, unless it went to trial, I wouldn't even know what their voice sounded like. And that the first time I'd get to have a conversation with them, if you can call it a conversation, would be cross-examining them in the witness box. I mean, so you're sort of trying to settle a case with your hand tied behind your back in many ways. Anyway, about 6 years ago, a couple approached me direct and said, look, we don't want that. We would really like you to tell us both what's fair, impartially, so we can hear it together. And I thought that I wouldn't be able to do it because of conflict rules. So solicitors can't advise couples together in that way because of their conflict rules. And I assume barristers would be the same. But I explored it with our regulator. And they said, no, you can't. You can't represent them, obviously, one or the other going forward, but you can advise them both together. And that's how the divorce surgery came about. So what we do is we now have a huge number of barristers of all levels of seniority that work with us. But we can get couples in at the earliest stage whenever they want. Actually, some of them, I mean, we've had couples come to us who've been in litigation for 5 years. I mean, they just want to find a way out, but can come to us, and they will then choose a barrister together that they're comfortable with and that we think has the right expertise for them. And they will get advice together about what that barrister thinks the outcome is. And it's a very short process. So most couples are with us for between 6 to 8 weeks, because we'll help them get their financial disclosure together, and then we get them the advice. And the idea is then that they're in the best possible place to reach a settlement, because they know what's fair and they know the way a judge will look at it. And that's what most couples want, actually. And what's interesting about doing this work, which is so great for me, is that you have the opportunity then to understand where each of them are coming from and their different perspectives. And you will just be given a different take on the same set of facts because they each have different perceptions about it. And that doesn't mean that either of them are wrong. It just means that they see it differently. But knowing each of their perceptions is so helpful in then explaining to them, well, look, this is how a judge would see it, and this is why they wouldn't quite take it from either of your perceptions, actually. And so let's free ourselves from kind of arguing about it. Let's focus instead on what a judge would do, because ultimately, when it comes to your finances, the judge has got to approve any deal you reach. So it doesn't really matter, even if you guys agree to a deal. If a judge isn't going to approve it, then you're back to the drawing board. So let's start with putting the pressure on this, figurative judge to tell us what the answer is, and then see how we can make that fit to meet both of your goals.
Brilliant. And then, because of that settlement, presumably then you're back into the kind of the paper-based exercise that avoids court entirely. And you mentioned 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, that is very, very different to if you go down the court route, or even, to be honest, the general route of negotiating with two solicitors. I mean, can you kind of give us a steer on average, kind of what a normal, if there is such a thing, because every divorce is different, but a sort of a standard, what you could expect if you went down the court route instead of your 6 to 8 weeks process?
Yeah, so I mean, the stats say that the average divorce takes 14 months. But if you end up in court proceedings, in my experience, it will take longer than that, because you end up with quite a lot of delay in terms of getting hearing dates. There are normally, in either a finance case or a children case, there'll be 3 sort of set hearings that every couple will go through. There may be more if it's a more complex case, but generally you'll have an initial hearing where it's investigating what evidence you need for the case to proceed. So in a children case, whether you need any separate professional kind of involvement in terms of an independent social worker or someone who can speak to the children. In a finance case, looking at whether you need any kind of valuation evidence of the assets and any pensions that are there. You'll then get a sort of middle hearing, and that's normally, 3 or 4 months after your first hearing. It normally takes 3 or 4 months to get the first hearing. So you can see how the time lags, but your middle hearing is trying to see if you can settle. So a judge will be saying, look, where are we getting to in terms of trying to get you both to reach a settlement? On a finance case, that would be a confidential hearing where a judge would say, look, this is what I think the answer is. And then if you can't settle at that point, it's normally another 6 months before you get a final hearing, which is, the trial, at which you both give evidence and then a judge imposes a view. So normally, if you're looking at litigation, you're looking at least 18 months. The average is 14 months. What we do within 6 to 8 weeks is we'll explain to a couple what the answer is. Now, alongside that, of course, you have your divorce petition. So that's a process which has its own time scale. Normally takes about 15 weeks, so about 3 months to get from lodging the divorce petition to a decree nisi. And then you've got to wait at least 6 weeks after that. But it's during that period when you're waiting for decree nisi that you should be talking about, let's try and reach an agreement on the finances. And that's really where our service slots in, or let's start talking about the children, which again is something that we can help with. But yeah, the time frame is hugely significant, I think, because from my perspective, I want to get couples to a place where they know what's fair so they can have constructive discussions. And for some couples that come to us, that means they come back a week later and say, yeah, that sounds great, we're done, let's draw up an order, we're agreed. For some, they're sitting up for ages. Summer holidays happen, life happens. They come back 6 months later and they go, oh, sorry, we finally got around to this. Yes, that's fine. It doesn't matter. It's not a race. But what matters is getting people out of a state where they're anxious because they don't know what the answer is, or they're coming at it from different perspectives, and so it's causing conflict between them. So it's just getting them as soon as you can to a place where they don't need to be in conflict.
And of course, by doing that, it naturally brings the cost down anyway, because you're not, prolonging it and having to pay the additional fees, etc. And emotionally, obviously, you're in a place where you can actually create a new normal and find ways to move on, especially if you've got that other support. So I'm guessing then the best case scenario is to try and approach this together, as you say, as though you're kind of moving house, and set a budget and think about the divorce process that has to happen, and then also having the right people around you to support you professionally to get to that conclusion a lot quicker, so that you can move on. Because as you quite rightly said at the beginning, which is very close to my heart, is particularly if you've got children, you are still a family and you still have to function as one after the divorce has been settled and the solicitors has stepped away and you're no longer in this legal process. You are a family throughout the divorce and post it as well. And the worst case scenario is you end up in court.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, it's obviously nuanced. There are people who have to go to court, and I'm a lawyer. Okay. So the last thing I want is for somebody to be scared of going to court when they need to, and there are situations where your safety is at risk. You must go to court. That's what they're there for, But in scenarios where there aren't those sort of situations such that you need the protection of the court, then yeah, it is thinking about taking charge and thinking what is going to be our default model for resolving things. And if you end up in a scenario where every conversation has to go through lawyers, then that becomes your default. And it's not just a really expensive default, it's a really stressful one. And, at the end of the day, the lawyers will go away eventually. And then you're left. And if you've got children, you're then left in an extremely difficult position of having to communicate about the day-to-day with somebody that you have a completely fractured relationship with. And, things are said in solicitors' letters, in witness statements, in barristers' skeleton arguments that can't be unsaid. And for them, and I know this myself, writing these documents, it's your day job. What are you there to do? You're there to advance your client's case in the best way you can. You're not there to not upset the other side. But inevitably, the words that you write can be hugely upsetting. And it's taken very, very personally. And the person that's blamed isn't you, actually. It's your client, even though they didn't write the words. So I think the more that you think about, not just how is this making me feel? What do I want for myself? But also, let's think about the perspective of my former partner and how this is going to make them feel. I think then you'll start to look at it in the round in a much more rounded way. Because that's what I always say to clients. I say, when we meet, if I'm in private practice, yeah, we can talk about what's in your best interests, and we will. Sorry, my dog's just barking. And we can talk about, strategies. But actually, we should spend the second half of this conference talking about the advice that your former partner is going to be getting right now. Because unless you see both sides of this, we're not going to properly see the bracket. So I spent a lot of time saying, okay, well, what would he or she be saying right now? Because then I can tell you the advice they'll be getting back, and you can start to build a much more three-dimensional picture about the competing interests and how a judge is going to look at this. Because if we just spend all of our time looking at it from your perspective, it's not how a judge is going to look at it. And actually, that's not helping you reach a settlement. What we need to be doing is thinking, okay, we spent some time looking at it from your perspective. Now we need to look at it from hers or his. And then we can have, a really holistic view about what the answer is.
And what's the best outcome as well, because the other side, people involved, as you said, is the children, and then they often pick up on this stuff too. And if the relationship is so fractured that they're only communicating through solicitors, you have to co-parent throughout your divorce process, 14, 18 months, whatever that is, and beyond that as well. So it has a huge impact to the children and your relationship with them and their own relationships when they grow up and go on to marry. It all plays its part. So yeah, thinking of all sides, I think, is fantastic advice, actually, and it's really refreshing to hear, because I have heard a lot of solicitors in particular say, I've heard my client speak about, this, and I, get it really attached to my clients, and then I get something from the other side and I think that doesn't sound a bit like my client, or I don't know where that's come from, kind of thing, because they're only, as you say, getting one side as opposed to trying to see the bigger picture. And
And I think the difficulty with that is that you're actually doing your client a great disservice if what you do is essentially become, instead of their lawyer, their sort of emotional support. You're not there to agree with everything they say. You're there to give them legal advice in a nice, kind way. But the reality is that a lot of litigation, particularly family litigation, is really nothing to do with finances, actually. Sometimes it's not much to do with the children. It's to do with fear, and it comes from a place, these kind of base fears that we have of, will I still be a parent post-divorce? Will I be able to provide for myself? Am I going to be required to go back to work when I don't want to? Am I going to be required to continue in a job I don't like? Am I still going to feel like a mum? Am I going to still feel like a dad? These sort of base fears that we have is often what causes litigation. And so a lot of it is about thinking, not just, okay, from a legal perspective, what do you each want to achieve, but moving back one stage further and thinking, what are they scared of? What are you scared of? Let's try and address this from the get-go. If we've got a parent who's afraid that they're going to be somehow demoted or less of a parent, let's make it really clear that our mission here is for you to continue to be a family. Our mission here is for, this child to have a better relationship with each of you on the other side of the divorce, because you're going to be better co-parents, because you're going to get rid of all the kind of, the intimate stuff that was going wrong. We can let that all go. And so it's addressing those fears at the beginning. And or somebody who feels that they're not very financially astute and is anxious that I don't understand the finances very well, and so am I going to be taken advantage of here? And maybe they've got friends kind of whispering in their ear going, he's going to take you to the cleaners, or and so it's addressing that fear from the very beginning of saying, okay, well, let's go together and instruct a financial advisor to talk us both through our finances transparently. Let's maybe share a lawyer who can then again talk us through all of that, who has the right expertise, so that both of us feel that there's a level playing field here and there isn't a power imbalance. And often if you can address what the fear is likely to be before it really kicks in, then you get rid of the reasons behind a litigation.
Yeah, because I think you're completely right. I think a lot of particularly bad behavior is usually out of coming from a place of fear, and it is exactly as you say, kind of tracing that back and finding out what that is and dealing with the root cause as opposed to the symptom. And that's very similar in kind of the stuff that I do as well. It's trying to unpick and get to the bottom of the root cause of what's the actual issue here, as opposed to the behavior that's playing out. Because I don't think people actually go out of their way to hurt one another. I think they just act out of, as you say, fear usually. It's really, really helpful, Sam. I know you mentioned at the start about the fact that we really need to change the stigma, and I know you talk really passionately about kind of having this being more kind of the norm, like moving house, and getting it more in kind of the media and stuff, because I think a lot of the assumptions that we have are driven by what we see and what we hear from friends, family, the media, social media, etc., that kind of say, oh, it's always like this, it's always a battle, and everyone goes to court and everyone fights it out, and they will try and take you for everything you got, and it is feeding all of that, those kind of misconceptions and kind of misrepresentation really of divorce and what it's there to do. And as you say, people can move away and be a lot happier because they're no longer together. It doesn't mean they're any less of parents. It just means that actually they've got an opportunity to go and meet someone who makes them a lot happier, and a happy amicable divorce is much better than a miserable marriage every day of the week. So is there any anything else you would want to add around kind of that wider issue and how we address that?
Yes, I mean, I say this all the time, you know, to couples when they come to us, and I don't think you can say it enough. And I always know when I'm saying it that they so desperately needed to hear it. But divorce is not a failure. Divorce is not damaging to children. You know, it's conflict that damages children. And actually leaving a marriage that isn't working is the successful choice to make. And we have this sort of gold standard that, you know, if you're married for 60 years, you get a telegram from the Queen, and, you know, that's seen as a great success. But if 40 of those years were deeply miserable, what is the point of that? What kind of example are we setting to our children? You know, that life is about ultimately the pursuit of happiness. Every day isn't happy. You have to work at relationships. I'm not saying you just give up on relationships when they're not joyful every day. But if day after day something is making you deeply, deeply unhappy, then that's the right thing to question. Is this right for me? You know, and couples who get divorced have opportunities open to them that couples that stay married don't have. You have the opportunity to fall in love again, get that butterfly feeling again. You can reinvent yourself. You know, so what we need to do is normalize divorce. When you say the word divorce, you know, everything you think of is negative. Why? We just need to make it like just a standard life change, so that even, you know, if a friend says to you, I'm getting divorced, you react in the same way as if they said, you know, they said, I'm leaving jobs. You know, you're not instinctively negative about that. You're like, oh my goodness, you know, how can I support you through that? How are you feeling about it? You know, I'm there to bolster you and support you, but not, oh, it's going to be awful. You'll end up in court. I obviously can't stay friends with her or him. You know, yeah, of course you can. You know, so I think we just need to be really grown up and reimagine what divorce means. And actually, when you speak to couples as you do, getting divorced, they don't want it to be a drama. They don't want it to be awful. They want it to be decent. And they want to get through the other side, preserving a good legacy of that marriage, being able to think, you know what, you know, yeah, the last 18 months have been tough, but we did 10 good years. And we had some great memories. We went on some great holidays, and we had our children, or whatever we did. You know, we're not going to let the ending contaminate everything that went before. And I think that, you know, we need to start in a much more aspirational way, actually, about what we want to achieve out of divorce. And rather than just getting through it, we should be thinking, okay, well, we want to thrive on the other side of this. So how do we need to approach it so that we'll be better, actually, and happier on the other side, and have a better relationship than we did when we were together? And so much of divorce is about feelings of loss as well. And whether you have children or not, it's about losing that person that for quite a significant period of your life was your person, right? Was your person that you went to with all of your emotional stuff, but also just, you know, the boiler's broken, or, you know, that was your person. And so it's about thinking, well, does this necessarily mean the complete loss of that person in my life? No, it shouldn't mean that. It means that you're not married anymore. It doesn't mean that you can't still have a friendship. You know, it doesn't mean that you don't still care about the other person, and that good things should happen to them. And if you're co-parents, of course, that's even more important. But even if you don't have children, these are significant relationships, and we need to exit them in a dignified way so that we preserve the good. And we let go of the things that you know weren't working. But yeah, I feel so strongly about it. And the thing is, when you talk about it to anybody and you start saying all of these things, they nod, you know, whether they're getting divorced or not. You know, they think, yes, that's so right. You know, why do we stigmatize divorce? Oh my goodness, yes. But it's about changing the portrayal in the media. It's about changing people's perceptions so that they know that it can be completely normal to go through a divorce without having a prolonged litigation, contentious conflict, kind of stressful
definitely
experience.
And also what it allows you to, as you kind of touched on, what it allows you to then have. And speaking for myself, I've got an incredibly blended family. We're huge, there's loads of us, because there's so much divorce in my family. But actually I wouldn't change it for the world, and I'm one of 6, and I would never, if you met any or all of us, I would never say, right, that one's a full blood, that's a half, that's a step. We are all family. We're all at every event, and it's amazing. But you get all of that through creating new relationships and having more room and space to meet new people. And it doesn't mean you necessarily are out with the old and in with the new either. You're all still part of the same family. So I think that as you say, we need to hear a lot more of that. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing all of your advice and tips and also your perspective on the wider issue, because I think, as you say, more people need to hear that, and we need to get it out there wider. And I'm sure it's been really, really helpful to those who've watched and those who watch the replay as well. So thank you very much for your time today.
It's an absolute pleasure. It was lovely to
Great.
have the chat.
Thanks, Sam. I'll see you soon. Bye.